Hey there, how are you? Good morning and welcome here to Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So I'm just going to do the thing on the curtain here. It's a little bit brighter than I anticipated. There we are. That should bring about less of a glare off my face, and good thing my head's covered up, otherwise you wouldn't be able to see anything. Anyways, I want to welcome you here to Prog Monster. This is a show that is dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. And my name is Murph, and I am the host of this show. So we're doing a live stream today. I decided that I want to start doing more live streams to get myself prepared for possibly having guests on as well. But for now, I just want to get used to doing it myself. Probably won't be too hard. I've done some Zoom stuff before, but it's been a while since I did anything where I'm talking to other people on the other end of the line. So thought I would just take my time and get it right. So today's episode, Into the Progverse, this will be the normal live stream. I'm debating whether to do this every Saturday or move this to Friday nights and do it Friday nights. If anybody wants to comment on that, they're welcome to do so. So today's topic is going to feature the band Yes, this band. We're going to be talking about them, their discography, a little bit about their history and some of the members of the band and just overall stuff about the band. So I'm going to do this kind of chronologically with their discography. So the stories that I will talk about will kind of follow the discography as it goes along. That's kind of my way of pacing it. And if anybody has anything they want to say or comment about during it, they are more than welcome to, more than welcome to make their comments. I'll try to answer any questions as well. And if anybody has answers for those questions, feel free to do them. So I generally get very dry mouth when I'm doing this kind of thing. So I decided I'm going to keep this water going the whole thing. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about Yes's prehistory. So this band, of course, came from Mabel Greer's toy store. That's where the name came from. So it didn't actually come from that particular name, but that was the name of the band prior to becoming Yes. So what happened was Chris Squire decided that they needed a vocalist. And so he had a drink or a coffee or whatever you want to call it with John Anderson. They had a conversation about him possibly becoming the singer for the band. John Anderson, of course, said that he would consider joining it, but he wasn't going to join a band called Mabel Greer's Toy Shop. So they had to eventually change the name. I'm not 100% sure about how that Yes name came about. I remember reading it before and hearing about it, but for some reason it didn't stick with me. Of course, Yes, we all know, is a British rock band coming out in the late 1960s. So their debut album, which is this one, just simply called Yes, came out in 1969 in July 25th to be exact. Also, this album was recorded in London at the Advision Studios and tried in both of these in London. Considered to be a bit on the psychedelic side, maybe a little proto-prog going on here. Yeah. But to me, when I listen to this, it's about 40 minutes long, which is fairly lengthy for that time period. Albums generally never exceeded that length of time. So I'm going to just move my my information sheet back a little bit just so I can, I'm not going to talk too long on this album because I'll be quite honest, this album doesn't really do much for me. It's got some interesting progressive stuff on it. It's not that it's terrible. It's not a terrible album. It just doesn't have anything that's really all that memorable. Yesterday and Today, I don't mind that tune, and Survival, which is the final track on the album. Both of these are decent tracks. The rest of them are just not really that memorable. Like I've heard them many times. I just can't tell you too much about them because I don't really remember too much about them. Other than my whole overall view of the album is that it's kind of got that psychedelic poppy feel to it. Not too psychedelic though. I wouldn't ever suggest that this is like anything like Jefferson Airplane or any of that kind of stuff. It does have some psychedelic feel to it though. So this was their first album. By standards, it's an okay album. They passed. Probably did better than maybe giving them credit for. Was produced by Paul Clay and Yes as well. So yeah, so on this album you've got John Anderson and Chris Squire, of course, the two that had the discussion. You also have Tony Kaye on keyboards. You have Bill Bruford on the drums, and you have Peter Banks on guitar. Not a bad lineup. You know, there's some pretty solid players on here. The bass is pretty strong, as you might expect. The rest, and to be honest with you, I think the keyboards are one of the stronger parts on this album. Not as strong as you might get later with Yes, but definitely an album that deserves a little bit of attention. So they didn't jump up quite a bit here on the second album. This album came out. We're going to jump and see when this came out. Pull it up here so I can give you a little bit of the information. Oh, wrong one. The problem with glasses is that even though they help you see things, they also block you from seeing things at the same time, if that makes any sense. So this album came out almost a year to the day. So 364 days later, they put out this album, which is called Time in a Word. This is not one of the better covers. There is another version of this has a much better cover on it. See if I can see it anywhere. No, this is just a kind of mainstream version of the album. And, you know, you'll see that on this album that Steve Howe has been put in the picture right here. And he wasn't with the band at the time. This was still Peter Banks. Still Peter Banks playing guitar here. Pretty much the same group of guys playing on this album. The album released July 24th, 1970. So almost a year to the day after their first one. Recorded again at Advision Studio in London. A little bit more progressive. So they've started to enter that part. It's almost the same length too. It's like 39 minutes, pretty much close to the same length on the Atlantic label. Of course, I don't think the first one. Nope, the first one was also on the Atlantic label. I thought it wasn't for some reason. And Tony Colton is producing this album. So it's a much better album. It's a big jump up for them. I still don't think it's a great album, but it's a good album. It's got some stuff on here that is much more memorable. Then, which is the opening track. I like that a lot. You got Sweet Dreams, probably my favorite track on here. Astral Traveler, of course, is one of the more well-known tracks on here, very progressive in its nature. And then the title track, Time in a Word, also a pretty solid song. So you got a little bit more memorable stuff going on here. The bass tone on this is really good. You know, it was at this point in time that Chris Squire showed his real prominence as far as his bass ability goes. You've got some. It's kind of funny. There's a lot of Hammond organ on here. Pretty dominating instrument on here. I'm not a big Hammond organ fan, but I do like Tony Kaye's use of it. I never think of him as a vast keyboardist, but he hits it and nails it pretty good on this album. I think the guitar is decent enough. And of course, Bill Bruford's drumming is strong. John Anderson's vocals, of course, I think are the more prominent thing on this, one of the most prominent parts of this album, along with Chris Squire's bass playing. So overall, I think this is a step up to going from an okay to a good album. Their second coming here, I guess, is what you want to call it. Time in a Word from Yes, their second album. So the next album up is a quantum leap forward. I know that's a Rush saying, but it applies perfectly to this album. So again, now Steve Howe is now prominent on this album, maybe the most prominent jump here. His writing skills really creating him is going to do the same thing. Bring up it on the charts here, just so in case there's something that I want to say, I'll be able to say because I'll have it in front of me. It's good to have a second computer now. It really helps a lot. So this album coming out not super long after the last one, maybe 6-7 months later, they put out the Yes album with their new guitar player, Steve Howe, taking over from Peter Banks. I think there was a bit, my understanding is there was a bit of a desire to move in a different direction from where they were going, and I don't think Peter Banks agreed with it, so he was kind of removed and replaced by Steve Howe. Really good guitar player, no doubt about it. To me, it's one of those pivotal moments, I guess, in Yes's history. That's why I was looking for that word. So this came out February 19th, 1971. So about 7 months, maybe a little longer later. Much better album. So you've gone from an okay to a good, all the way up to a great album. This is a fantastic album. And the funny part is I didn't initially like it either. I found it was similar to a little bit too similar to Time and a Word for me at the time because I went backwards from drama, and this one was just more like the earlier stuff, but it had grown on me. It's now my second favorite, probably my second favorite album by Yes. I like it a lot. Of course, you have at the Ad Vision and it's Fitzrovia, studio in London. Those studios in London, considered a progressive rock album. I don't know what else you would consider it. To me, it's full-on prog here, or progressive if you prefer. It's a little longer than the first two albums, a couple minutes longer than the last one, 41 minutes. Still well within the range that I like normally. And of course, again, on the Atlantic Records, the big change here is that Eddie Offord comes in and joins Yes to help produce this album. And really, it's the first strong album by these guys, it's a really strong album. You've got, for me, it started out, my liking of the album started out with I've Seen All Good People, but that quickly passed away from me and was replaced by Starship Trooper. So this to me was an absolute incredible song and really put this album on a list for me, especially the part called The Worm at the end. Just fantastic. I love it. But you also have a couple of other tunes that jumped up not too long after I started liking the album, which were Yours Is No Disgrace and Perpetual Change. These two songs were underrated at the time. I think Yours Is No Disgrace has become a kind of a iconic song for this album and that era of Yes. It wasn't initially, but I think it's really become that way. Adventure and Clap are both decent tunes. So there's no weak songs on here, and all of the stuff on here, unlike the previous albums, is much more memorable. Really catchy stuff. I just like this a lot. I think Steve Howe's element, the writing element, and also his guitar playing are vastly superior and exactly what they needed, and they got it. Chris Squire, of course, is going to be Chris Squire. He's solid, a great bass player here. I think Bill Bruford comes a little bit more forward on this album too, showing off why he, I think, is one of the best drummers in rock and in jazz fusion as well. Just such a great drummer. And we've got John Anderson's voice, of course, the same as it is now, even some 55 years later. He still has that voice. It hasn't changed. To me, it's one of the most outstanding vocal parts. And then, of course, you've got Tony Kaye again playing that really strong organ on this. It's some of the more dominant keyboard parts is on this album as well. I think the problem with Tony Kaye and the reason why he didn't last beyond this album is that, according to the band, he just didn't want to get into the synthesizer part, and they wanted to go in that direction. They wanted to become a lot more proggy and go off into a lot more different areas, and he didn't want to go there, and they needed that, so he was removed after this album. So yeah, so the band is evolving. You've got coming in, you've got Steve Howe, and then eventually exiting after this album is Tony Kaye. So that's it for the Yes album, their third studio album. So their next studio album, another quantum leap forward again. You know, they've gone up from okay to good to great to fantastic now. So this album really cemented them as a giant in the prog music community, in my estimation. And for me, at the beginning of my Yes journey, this was the album that really made, you know, they took over from Rush as my favorite band in 1982, 83, in that time period, largely on my discovery and playing of this album. That's really what kind of put them over the edge into the number one spot as my favorite band. Now, they are not my favorite band now, and I'll get into that later, but at that time, this was the album. You know, this was the album we all loved. You know, it's, some people have said that the 4-bit pieces that each of the members played of their own, if you could have taken that out and put in a couple of more songs, this would have been a much stronger album. To be honest, I think it's what gives the album its character. I do like that idea of maybe having a couple more stronger songs, but if it's at the expense of taking out the 4-bit pieces, I wouldn't be in favor of that. Just because they make this album unique. It's the one unique album like that. So this album again came out November the 12th, 1971. So the same year as the Yes album, but later in the year. A much later album at the same studios in London. A little bit shorter than the Yes album. And again on Atlantic, and the same Yes and Eddie Offord producing. So pretty much identical in every way except for the biggest difference here is the bringing Rick Wakeman into the fold and replacing Tony Kaye. So Rick Wakeman, I think, personally think he's the best keyboardist of all time. You know, people are going to argue with me and say Keith Emerson. I never really followed Emerson, Lake and Palmer that much, so I can't really say or comment on which one is better, other than I have a lot of involvement with Yes and a lot of emotional commitment to the band. And I like some of Rick Wakeman's solo stuff. And to me, he's the best. Now, I'm not going to say that Keith Emerson isn't better. Maybe other people may have a different opinion of it. I can't say too much about Emerson other than I know a few stuff by him. So it would be an unfair comparison for me to compare the two, since I know very little about him and much more about Rick Wakeman. Anyways, Rick Wakeman adding a huge dimension here, not only with the keyboards, but the soloing, the use of all different types of keyboards, not just the Hammond organ. You know, harpsichord, not so much harpsichord on here, but a little bit, and some of the mellotron as well. The song Roundabout, of course, was their first really bang-on hit. Yeah, you had a little bit of that with I've seen All Good People, but this was a much better song, much more graphed. I still like this song a lot. I know some people kind of put it down a bit. I don't know why. It's a great song, probably just overplayed. That's all it is. But, you know, you also have South Side of the Sky, Long Distance Runaround, and Heart of the Sunrise as the other 3 full songs on here. All absolutely killer. Especially to me, Heart of the Sunrise is one of the most underrated Yes songs. The bass tone on there is incredible, as it is on most of the songs on this album. But for me, that is the song that it stands out the most of. The lyrics are a little bit kind of surreal, I guess you might want to call it. John Anderson like surreal. But I don't dislike any of them. I think this is a well orchestrated, well put together, well crafted, well produced album. And even some of the bit parts like Cans and Brahms, which is kind of an interesting part. I do like the We Have Heaven. I think it's because of his use of different kind of vocal structures on there. And of course, the mood for the day is probably the big. Well, the fish is too. The fish and mood for the day, really the two best kind of bit parts on here. I like both of them quite a bit. And of course, I would be remiss by not mentioning Bill Bruford's 5% for Nothing. Just a little bit of a percussionist part that adds to the end of side one. I believe that's how it works out. So, yeah, an excellent album. Of course, the album cover is the first of the Roger Dean album covers, and a quantum leap forward to anything they'd done on the cover of their albums before. Yeah, just so much better. The music is much more cohesive and progressive, and every element that you like about Yes, you will find on this album. So for me, this was the best album of its time when it came out, and was the Yes album that really pushed me over the top with them. But now we're going to move up a little bit. So each of their albums has progressively gotten better. You've gone from okay to good to great to fantastic and to incredible. This album may be, my opinion only, I'm not suggesting other people may have different opinions, but in my opinion, this is the best, not only of Yes's albums, but of all Prog albums. This is the best Prog album. A little bit of a dip in the cover, although I do like the cover a lot. Some people find it a little bit plain for such a great album. But, many people would have liked to have had this part in the middle. Like, that would have been a fantastic cover. But would it have represented what's on the music? It's hard to say. I've gotten so used to this greenish, dark kind of, this greenish, darker color top part too. I've gotten used to it. It's almost murky in color, and the album is a little, even though it's well produced and there's lots of stuff going on, I still hear stuff going on here that I didn't hear before. It's a little bit murkier than some of their other stuff. I'm just going to call it up here so I can give you the stats on it. So Close to the Edge. Most Yes people will say that this is their best or really close to their best album. I do like it. This is a Roger Dean cover. The wording, of course, is the Roger Dean wording. Again, Eddie Offord and Yes doing this album. Fantastic. This was released September the 8th, 1972. So not quite a year after Fragile, but really well put together album. It's the shortest of their 5 albums up to this point. It's only 37 minutes, almost 38 minutes long. Just 3 songs on it, produced on the Atlantic record label again by Eddie Yes and Eddie Offord on here as well. Bill Bruford complained there was so much dinkering around here and fooling around here that it just made him crazy. He couldn't take it anymore, and thus he ended his career with Yes. So another, they've gone now 3 straight albums where somebody's left the band. So Bruford's out after this album. And this is probably his best effort with Yes as far as his drumming goes. Such a fantastic drummer. This album is the reason why he's my number 2 drummer for sure. Just an absolute killer album. You've got the title track, Close to the Edge, which is absolutely so complex, so much going on, all of these great interwoven melodies, and John Anderson's voice on top of it. Even the lyrics, as strange as they are kind of great in some ways. I really like them. It's easily my favorite track on this album. The other 2 I like a lot too, so don't read anything into that. And You and I is one of the best kind of, I would call it almost, thinking of the word, how to describe it, very kind of pastoral in some sense. That's the word I was looking for. But a lot of good stuff going on here. The vocals are fantastic. Again, it's probably my favorite lyrical part on this album. And then you've got maybe the heaviest track on the album, Siberian Katru. This is another fantastic song. Like, all 3 of these songs are among my favorite Yes songs. making this the great, to me, this is one of the greatest albums of all time, in my top 5 albums of all time. Really good construction of chords and complexity. Bass is fantastic again. Steve Howe, I think, is even better on this album than he was on Fragile. And of course, Rick Wakeman's solo and his whole keyboard domination here is fantastic. So this is a great album. Can't say enough about it. So after Bill Bruford leaves, the band has to come up with a new drummer. Didn't take them long to find somebody. They picked up for the tour Alan White. So Alan White comes in to play drums here and stays with the band right up till very recently when he passed away. So he's been with the band for more than 40 years at that time. So we're going to redo this, bring up the information on this album here. So this album, a little bit different again. This is probably another journey further into progressiveness. It's a double album, a concept album, and lots of stuff going on here. Just some absolute brilliant moments on this album. I think this is one of their better album covers as well. So the album is Tales from the Topographical Ocean. It's a double album released in 1973, December the 7th. So a little bit more than a year after their last one, and also featuring Alan White's kind of debut with the album, although I do think he did do some with this album, which I would talk a little bit about. So this is a 73 album, live album, which is pretty much the stuff for the first 5 solo album, or the first 5 discs in the discography, and they play them all live here. It's really great. I like this. There's a little bit of Rick Wakeman's Six Wives of King Henry VIII going on here. There's some other excerpts from the Fire Suite. Yeah, there's just lots of stuff here. It's a really solid album. Not going to spend too much time on it, but if you like live, it was a triple vinyl album when it came out, but it's now I think it's just 2 discs. So anyways, this one came out, Tales of the Topographical Ocean. Again, Yes and Eddie Offord doing yet another album together. They've had nothing but success at this point. Up to this point, anyways. This is about 80 minutes in length. The remastered's a little bit longer, around 82. So a lot longer of an album, almost twice the size of any of their other albums up to this point. Hence the reason it was a double album. Morgan Williston in London. So a couple of different studios than they had been working at. So they tried something different. Released, of course, December 7th, 73. To me, up until close to the edge, their momentum was skyrocketing, and then it gets to this album and it drops and begins to drop. So they're not what they had been, but still really good. Some people would say this is their best album. I think this is a really hard album to penetrate. I've been listening to it now for a very long time. I still haven't fully penetrated. There are some parts of it on The Ritual, of course, and Reveling in Science of God. I like both of those tracks. The other 2 tracks I'm not so crazy about. But it's an album that continues to grow with me. So eventually maybe this will make it up to that vaulted high in the sky that Yes had at that point in time. But for now, it's just not making it quite as far. So the only real difference on this album is Alan White is the new drummer. He did a decent job on here. I don't think he's as good a drummer as Bill Bruford, and a very different drummer. This album's a little more stark as well. I don't know if that has anything to do with the difference in the drumming or just the entire concept of putting this album together that made it a little bit different than some of their other stuff going in. But not a bad album. Better than their first 2 for sure. Maybe not as good as the last 3 going into this. So next up, we have their 7th studio album. I'm just going to go back and get the information on it. This one was very different for me personally. when I initially got into Yes, it went from Drama. I went back to Fragile, jumped up to Tormato, went back to Close to the Edge, jumped up to Going for the One, went back to this particular album, Marie Layer. So my friend had this album, taped it for me, so I had it on, believe it or not, 8-track cassette recordings. Yeah, not a good way to discover such a complex album, but for me, that's what happened. I did get it later in cassette, still not really that good. So maybe the venues for this album for me didn't really work too well. It was a very hard album to penetrate, not as bad as Tales of the Topographical, but definitely hard to penetrate. And of course, you have another Rick Wakeman dropped out after the Tales of Topographical, making it the 4th album in a row that somebody left and somebody new came in. The new person coming in here is Patrick Moraz, who had some background in that progressive feeling, and gives this album a very different feel. But I think he actually is such a great keyboardist. I don't think there was not a drop. I don't think, not a lot of a drop if there was. The album is much more complex, much more sophisticated. I think they've kind of, on this album, they've taken the complexity that they had on Tales of the Topographical and condensed it a bit and moved a little bit left towards the jazz fusion type sound that you get with this album. The album cover is one of the best of all the Yes covers. At this point in time, I would say the 2 best were Tales and this one as far as their album covers went, if you're going chronologically here. So this album, we're going to talk a little bit about it. Released November the 29th, 74, maybe almost a year later from Tales of the Topographical. The New Pipers and Virginia Waters studio in Surrey. So in different places. So it was recorded completely different place than the other ones. Same producing, Yes and Eddie Offord are both producing here as well. It's a 40-minute long album, so fits well within the amount of time that they normally put on an album. They tend to be very consistent up to this point, except for, of course, Tales, which was a double album. Gain, this one moves a little further towards the jazz fusion and a little bit more. So they've kind of come up psychedelically and then full on prog right up till Close to the Edge, and then kind of start to dip with Tales of Topographical. And now they're moving a little bit further away with the jazz fusion element here. And that's possibly the reason why it took me such a long time, almost 30 years, to get really into this album. And then at one point I bought this disc, and then the album really started to take off because I now had a good venue to listen to it on. I never owned this on vinyl, but the Gates of Delirium, just absolutely killer, fantastic tune. Not totally different from Close to the Edge as far as the length, and the sound of the song is a little bit more complex, but it's just fantastic. Sound Chaser, this may be the best version of Steve Howe's guitar soloing ability that you'll find anywhere in Yes. Just absolutely fantastic. To Be Over, a little bit more like maybe And You and I. So a lot of similarities between this and Close to the Edge, I think. Very similar albums. Both is very complex with lots of complex stuff going on. So, but on here, you, instead of having Rick Wakeman's soloing going on and stuff, you have Patrick Moraz, who's a little bit different of a keyboardist, but still a really good one. So at this point now, I think this is a better album than Tales of the Topographical. So if you're looking, if you're drawing a curve, so they start here and they start to go and up, they get to Close to the Edge, and then they dip, and then start slightly coming back up with this album. Now, this album has continued to grow with me. It's still not a masterpiece in my collection, but it's very close. And many people cite this as their favorite Yes album. If you're a person that's really into that complexity, it's probably the most complex of their albums as well. So now we're going to move up to studio album number 8, which is this one, Going for the One. I'm going to bring up the info on it so that I can talk a little bit more about it. So now at this point, they've kind of jumped up a little bit. This is a bit of a different direction with them. So they decided that they were going too far the other way. They bring Rick Wakeman back to the fold. This album is almost, I think this is about 2.5 years after the Relayer. So they've had a lot of time to decide. I'm not sure why progressive bands like to put the rear ends of naked men on the covers of their albums, but it seems to be common. So anyways, this was released July 15th, 1977. Recorded at the Mountain, Montreux, and in Switzerland, and it's considered a progressive album. So they've come back from that jazz fusion stuff that they were starting to get into, and have come full circle back to a prog. This album is a lot more mainstream sounding, more poppy, actually. I wouldn't say it's poppy at all. It does have some a lot more classical elements to the music. It's a more polished album too. So this was produced by Yes, by themselves. So Offered is off of this album. And so you've got more of a smooth sounding album, I think. I've released on Atlantic again, 38 minutes in length. So not really a lot of difference in the technical parts, except for Eddie Offered isn't on here. And you can see it's a much smoother album. The production is, I think, better than most of their previous albums, maybe just due to the fact that the production elements are much stronger at this period as going forward. And it's been a couple of years, so they've got 5 songs on here, but it has the masterpiece of Awakening on here, which is one of the great Yes songs. They haven't had a song like that at that point since Close to the Edge. So just a fantastic tune, but the rest of the tracks are pretty good too. Turn of the Century, more of a classical bit, more toned down, classical, maybe classical progressive elements in it. Going for the One is more of a mainstream type song, same as Parallels. These are the two kind of more commercial sounding, if you prefer. I wouldn't say either of them is commercial sounding, but they definitely have more of that commercial sound than the rest of the album. Wondrous Dreams is kind of that separation. Now you're starting to get some of that John Anderson dominated stuff going on here with that song. But a good solid album. To me, it's not a masterpiece, but it's with like Relayer right in there with those, like number one. I think I like Relayer a little bit better than this, but not terribly much like this, but they're very different in sounds. So we're going to go on to the next album. This is where some people think they went off the rails. There was a lot of infighting with this album. Just going to bring it up here on the day board so I can talk about it. So this album was released about a year later, a little more than a year, I think. Released September 22nd, 1978, back to Advision Studios in London, Rack in Regent Park in London. It's about 40 minutes, still staying well within the normal frame of time that they like to use. And it's on the Atlantic label, of course. All their albums up to this point have been. Just going to pull it down a bit. And produced once again by them. No Eddie Offered here. 9 tracks in total. A little bit of a weird cover. So this is maybe the first one in a while that they haven't, or the last couple they haven't used Roger Dean on this one and the previous one. And not the best of covers. Maybe one of the weaker covers, actually. You've got Rick Wakeman again back here as he was with Going for the One. Alan White is on drums again, and then you have Chris and Steve playing the guitars and bass here. This is a pretty strong instrumentally album, but it has some weak points to it as well. So it's a very different, it's a bit of a fragment. If you want to use the word fragmented album, you could use it on this one. So you've got some real progressive stuff going on here, like On the Silent Wings of Freedom, maybe Arriving UFO, Future Times and Rejoice. These are and even Matt Rigel. But then you have songs like Don't Kill the Whale and Onward, maybe even Release, which are a little bit more mainstreamish. Not, I wouldn't call them mainstreamish, but they're a little bit closer to that element. And then, of course, you have Circus of Heaven, which I personally like. It's one of my favorite tunes on the album, but I know that this song is attacked relentlessly by a lot of the prog community as being just stupid. I do like the vocals. It's a very John Anderson-like tune, maybe my favorite of his. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. You can clearly see it's a little bit thin at times. There's a little bit of that thin sound to it. I think it's because they used more of the Biotron than they did of the Mellotron, and not as much organ on here as some, but you got a lot more harpsichord. It's a very different album. It's a little bit more separated. It's a clear sounding album. John Anderson's vocals are good. I like most of the tunes on here, and that's why, for me, it's a masterpiece. But I know for most people, this was kind of the end of them, of that era of Yes. I kind of get that, but I don't share it. That's all. So that was their 9th studio album. So their next studio album, this is a very big change for Yes, and this is actually the entranceway for me. This is the album that brought me into the band from 1980. Just going to pull down my info a little bit so I can look at it while we're talking. We're talking about drama. So back to Roger Dean here. And, you know, you've got Eddie Offord back here as well. So you've got Eddie Offord back, Yes. So this is the first album after the last 2 where they've come back to Eddie Offord, come back to Roger Dean, trying to capture a little bit more of that element. But they've added, Rick Wakeman is gone, John Anderson is gone. So the voice of Yes is very different on this. Released August the 22nd, 1980. Townhouse and Sarm East Studios in London. Roundhouse and Rack Studios in London for the guitars only. Progressive rock. Yeah, some people say it's pop. I think it's more like hard rock, to be honest, than it is like pop. 36 minutes, probably the shortest of their albums up to this point. Again on Atlantic, and as I said, Eddie Offord's back in here. It's a well-produced album, I think. It was my entry point to Yes, so all that John Anderson stuff we talked about was all new to me as we were going backwards. No Rick Wakeman here. I think Jeff Downes is a good keyboardist. For this particular album, he gives a totally different sound than you would get from any of the other Yes albums. Steve Howe's tone is really heavy on this. I think it's the only time he's ever been like that, really. And it's just so good. All 6 of the tunes on here are great or really good. I know White Car's a little bit short, but I have a preference for that song, so I'm going to stick to it. But, you know, like Machine Messiah, Tempest Fugit, these are 2 heavy songs, really well respected, really well liked. Doesn't really happen. This is a kind of a heavy bass, but this song is also a deep cut that doesn't get enough attention. I think it may be the best song on the album myself. Into the Lens was kind of a Buggles influence stuff, the same as maybe Run Through the Light. Those 2 songs, a little bit more of a Buggles influence. I think Trevor Horn's voice is good on the album, but it's not John Anderson, and he wasn't received very well by people because of that. But I think this album is done well over time. It's become much more loved over time. It's in my top 5 favorite Yes albums. Very different from their early stuff, but really catchy. It's a one only album. They never did anything before like this, and they never did anything really after like this. So Drama, their 10th. Is this their 10th studio album? I believe it is. Yep, I think it is their 10th studio album. So we're going to move along a little faster now. We've done most of the earlier stuff, which is the main stuff for Yes. From this point on, Yes becomes different. So you got your next 3 albums. We're going to kind of do them together quickly, because this is an era that I did like when it was here, but I've never, it hasn't withstood the test of time with me for sure. I don't really ever go to these albums ever anymore. And at the time, I liked them quite a bit. So we're going to just move it down so I can see if I can get it to come down here. Yeah, so the first of the three, the two that are more important, 90125 from Yes. Lots of really poppy stuff here. There's still some prog stuff here, no doubt about it, but it's more new wave-ish prog than it is like the classical prog that you got from before. Released November the 7th, 1983, so almost 3 years have passed. Very different band, very different sounding band. Sarm and Air Studios in London, where it was recorded, about 44 minutes long, so it's a little bit longer than they normally do. And this one is not on Atlantic, it's on Atco. Trevor Horn being the producer of this album, along with the rest of Yes. So you got John Anderson on vocals, Chris Squire on bass, guitar, and vocals. Trevor Rabin comes in replacing Steve Howe on guitars and keyboards. Yeah, John's back replacing Trevor Horn, although Trevor Horn is the producer of this album. Alan White on drums, percussion, and vocals, and then Tony Kaye's back, having not played with this band for a lot of years at this point. Comes back in as the keyboardist. So you got a lot more simpler, straightforward, rocking sound, very poppy album, very mainstream sounding. Songs like Owner of a Lonely Heart, Changes, and where is it? Hearts. These are all songs played quite a bit on the radio at the time. It Can Happen, Hold On. There's some really clear sounding, but very poppy, very different from anything they'd done up at that point. Album did very well. Owner of a Lonely Heart is, I think, their biggest selling song of all time. Yeah, so at this point, I wouldn't call them a prog band anymore, but there's still some prog elements here. Hearts and Changes and It Can Happen all have a little bit of progginess to them as well. Then they move up again. Go back and then back up. So their next album, which is their 12th studio album, very not totally dissimilar from 90125. Musically, they're almost identical. Big generators, this one. There's about 4 years between the two albums, though. This one's September 28th, 1987. Lark Recording Studios in Italy. The SARM East, the SARM West, and Air Studios in London. Lots of different studios to record this album. You've got Southcom Studios, Westlake Studios, Sunset Sound Studios in Los Angeles, California. So they were all over the map with this album as far as recording goes. It's kind of a boring cover, so this is not a Roger Dean. It's simplistic, very stark, same as their last album. There's not much to either of the covers. They're not going to win any awards for these covers, that's for sure. It's a pop album, a little more poppy than 90125. Not as much progressive elements at all, if any, on this. On the Atco record label. And produced by Yes, Trevor Horn, Trevor Rabin, and Paul DeVeris. So a little bit more versatile. It's about 43 minutes long, so it's about the same as 90125 that way. So the biggest difference is this doesn't have that massive hit that they had with Owner of a Lonely Heart. The songs are well written, though. Rhythm of Love, Almost Like Love, Love Will Find the Way. These are all similar type tracks. My favorite particular track on this album is probably Holy Lamb. It's more of a John Anderson kind of single song, but I've always liked it. For a quiet, slow song, I do like it quite a bit. It's probably one of my favorite, but yes, they don't have many like that. But so very poppy, more poppy even than 90125, which was poppy to begin with. And that's the direction they were at. So this is now 1980. It's now 1987. So they've been together a very long time at this point. This has pretty much the same people on it as you had, these identical people on it that you had on 90125. I think it's not quite as good of an album. It's kind of like the weaker sister of the two. So I'm going to jump up to the next album. So at this point, there was a second band that was going on, which was called Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe. They put out an album in 1990, very Yes-like, actually, a lot more Yes-like than Yes was. The biggest difference, there was no Chris Squire wasn't on the album. He was on the other band. So they kind of decided they would try to pull together and do something together, which featured this album, Union. So this album was released in April 30 of 1991, about a year after the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe thing. I actually was going to include that as part of the Yes discography, but it's not officially a Yes album, so I won't do it. So Muraval in studios in France, also Welleman Tell in Paris, France, the Sarm West in London, Record Plant in Jakarta, and in the Jacaranda Room in Los Angeles, Vision Sound and Platinum Island, New York City, and Langley in Devon, England. So it's, again, produced all over the place. And it makes sense because you've got so many musicians on here. There's 8 in total. John Anderson, Bill Bruford, Steve Howe, Tony Kaye, Trevor Rabin, Chris Squire, Rick Wakeman, and Alan White. So Bruford's back after a long absence from Yes. Steve Howe's back after an absence from Yes. Tony Kaye again. So then you have the Tony Kaye, Trevor Rabin, Chris Squire, Alan White version of the band. Trevor Horn is out. John Anderson is Trevor Horn was already out. John Anderson is also in this. So they really what they've added is Bruford, Howe, and Wakeman to the band that were in the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe album. So they just brought the 3 back in. So it's a mishmash of a lot of stuff. Many people. So you've got the LP version is about 59 minutes in length. The international version is 65. And the European Japanese version of this is about almost 70 minutes. It's on Arista label, so it's not on the one that they had been on. And it's produced by Jonathan Ellis, Steve Howe, Trevor Rabin, Mark Mancini, and Eddie Offord are all in on this. But there was lots of conflict on this album. There were songs that were changed. Parts that were played by some members were taken out in favor of somebody else playing the parts. Yeah, so a lot of problems with this album. It does have some good parts to it. The Roger Dean cover here, I think, is good. It's very reminiscent of the Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe album. Very, very similar covers, I think. And you've got all this different stuff going on. There's some of that poppy Yes going on, some of that progressive Yes going on. Lots of stuff going on here. I don't know that this is terribly a memorable album, but it's not a bad album. So, but a lot of members that were playing on this were just, they don't want to, you're just trying to remember. Bill Bruford quickly left after that. Rick Wakeman wasn't overly pleased either. So at any rate, that was their 13th studio album, I believe. Yeah, 5, 10, 12, 13. So number 14, I don't own. It's not an album that I care to really own, and I don't know a lot about it, so I'm not going to say much about it. I know it was kind of the last of the Trevor Rabin era albums. So I'm just trying to move down a bit here so I can see what I'm doing. So this album came out a few years later from Union. So Union came out, the band kind of dissolved a bit, and then this group came back together. So this is the 90125 group of people. And the album is called Talk. It's just a white album with a Yes, colored Yes thing on it. There's no Roger Dean going on here. Trevor Rabin produced this album. So it's kind of his baby in a lot of ways. Recorded at the Jacaranda Room in Hollywood and A&M in Hollywood as well. released on March the 21st, 1994. It's about 54 minutes in length, so fairly lengthy album. And this is during that era when CDs were, people were putting as much, they now got out of the mindset that they only had 40 minutes to work with on the vinyl. Now they can have much more space to work with on the CD. So people started expanding the amount of music they've in. This was on the Victory Music label. So again, a different label. On this album, I believe, I don't own it. I'm just going to check to see if the personnel is who. Yeah. So the personnel on this is the same personnel on both Big Generator and 90125. So it's kind of a similar album. I think it's a little heavier than those two albums from what I've heard of it. I've heard it maybe a couple times, but I've never actually owned this album. It's an album I would buy if I seen it, but I haven't seen it. So, and it's not something that I go looking for. So it would have to be something that I ran across in order for me to buy it, probably. But still, you know, you've got the members from that particular group of Yes. So it's probably got a very similar sound, and I've heard it, and it does have similar sounds to that. So the next album out is the Keys to Ascension. This is Keys to Ascension 1 and the Keys to Ascension 2. So we'll deal with 1 first, obviously. Makes more sense, right? So these are both fairly new to me. I do like the artwork on both of them quite a bit. So this is a return to Roger Dean. Really good artwork on both of these two albums here. One's blue, one's purple. Although the album itself on Ascension 2 is actually baby blue. You can see it's almost identical, but it's just two different colors. Really colorful albums. This one is more the same color. Actually, not really any difference. Where Ascension 2 has the purple over cover. Both really good. So Ascension 1 was released October the 28th, 1996. Recorded at Firemount. Sorry, doesn't say where it was. Oh, yeah, studios. Fremont Theater in San Luis Obispo, California. Not familiar with it. Yes Studios in Lewis and San Luis Obispo studio again. Progressive rock considered. It's very lengthy. It's a double album, about 116 minutes. So that's almost 2 hours worth of stuff. And it's on the Essential labels. So I'm just going to move it down here so I can see a little bit more. Yeah, so Tom Fletcher and Yes doing the production of this album. It's a good album. I don't mind this one. It's currently getting ready to go into my playlist. The side one is basically a live set of music featuring songs like Siberian Catru, Revealing Science of God, America, which was on, I think America was on the second album, Time and a Word, on Onward, which is from Tormato, and Awaken, which is from Going for the One. So you have a live album. And then the second disc has 2 more live songs, Roundabout and Starship Trooper. But then you have 2 studio tracks that were recorded to complete the album, which is Be the One and That Is. And they're both fairly lengthy tracks. One's about 10 minutes. The other one, a little over 19 minutes. So currently listening to this, I like this. I like the 2 tracks that weren't talked about, that weren't originally recorded on anything else. They're quite good. This features John Anderson, Steve Howe, Chris Squire, Rick Wakeman, and Alan White. So the same kind of group that you had with Tormato and Going for the One are back here together. So what we might call the classic Yes group, minus, of course, Bill Bruford. So, oh, sorry, came out of the sleeve. So the second one of the 2 is called Ascension 2. So this is the second Keys to Ascension 2, which came out the next year. Recorded November 3rd, released November 3rd, 1997. So about a year later. And as you can see, it's the same cover. If I can get you to see that. It's just that one is blue and one is in a purple jacket. Fremont Theater, San Luis Obispo in California. So same spot that they recorded the other one. This is where they recorded this one. So this is Keys to Ascension 2, of course. 101 minutes, so a little bit shorter than that first album. Again, on the Essential label, and again, this one by Yes and Billy Sherwood this time. You've got the same basic group of people here. Yeah. Anderson, Howe, Squire, White, and Wakeman are all on here again. So it's the same group that was on the Ascension 1. This one's a little bit different. There's a live recording in San Luis Obispo featuring I've Seen All Good People, Going for the One, Time and a Word, Close to the Edge, Turn of the Century, and You and I. But then the second side of this, or the second disc if you prefer, is new studio tracks. And this one has basically 5: Mind Drive, Footprints, Bring Me to the Power, Children of the Light, which has a 2-part soliloquy, Children of Light, and Lifeline. Suite is what I meant to say, not soliloquy. I take that back. And then Sign Language, which is the final track here. So again, the same group of guys doing a second album with a similar title and similar cover. And I do like both of these. I think they're both pretty good. Do I think they're as good as the classic? Yes. No, I would say that I don't feel that way about them, but I do like them both. So now we start to move on to some really different stuff as they move along. So then you have Open Your Eyes, which is the next album. This one, again, completely different from Gates of Ascension as far as the art goes. It's just a basic Yes in orange red with the title of the album up. It's kind of a boring cover. This one features, of course, John Anderson, Steve Howe, Billy Sherwood, Chris Squire, and Alan White. So out the door, again, is Rick Wakeman, which isn't really that unusual for Rick Wakeman. He doesn't tend to stick around too long. Always, because he does so many of his own projects. Sometimes he just doesn't get involved, I guess. So this one was released November 24th, 1997, so a little bit later than the last one. I think at this point, this is like their 16th studio album, maybe. Progressive rock, of course, but this one has a little bit of a pop element to it. So this to me is one of those albums that kind of fits both eras of Yes, the progressive stuff and the kind of pop stuff. It's one of those albums that fits in there. 72 minutes in length, so very lengthy, almost a double size. And if I'm correct, I think it's just the one studio album, but it's just they've piled as much as they can on the CD here. This is on the Eagle label in UK and Beyond Music in the US, and produced by Yes. So I've listened to this in entirety. Nothing really stands out. It's to me, it's a bit of an unmemorable album. Not only does it have an unmemorable cover and stuff, the music is kind of unmemorable too. Billy Sherwood, I believe, is playing keyboards on this. I think that's what he's doing. He's not playing bass or guitar because Steve and Chris are doing that. So I'm assuming he's playing keyboards. Somebody else might know. If you know, let me know. So to me, it's just almost an forgettable album. Although I have listened to it recently, and I'm finding myself not disliking it at all. So we're going to move on to the next part. They have a ton of albums. This one is The Ladder. So The Ladder kind of is that first album after the classic era that isn't poppy. So it's not during that poppy era in the 80s, but it has a more return to their roots. I like the album cover quite a bit. little bit different of a logo and stuff, but definitely a Roger Dean cover. Some good stuff on the back as well, as you see. So this came out September 29th, 1999. So just before the millennium, or just, before the millennial and the century ended. Recorded at Armory and Kitsilano in Vancouver. 60 minutes, so it's not as long as the predecessor, but still quite a bit longer than the average Yes album. It's on the Eagle label again. And Bruce Fairbairn is the producer of this album. So if I'm correct, yes, I am. This is one of the few albums in which, I think this might be the only album in which Yes has 6 members. So you got, was one of the first ones, because I think some of their later albums also have that. So John Anderson, lead vocals, Steve Howe, lead and acoustic guitars, steel, mandolin, and vocals, Billy Sherwood on guitars and vocals, Chris Squire on bass and vocals, Alan White on drums, percussion, and vocals, and Igor Koroshev on keyboards. So that's the big difference, is the keyboard is pretty dominant. And then you've got a bunch of other people playing horn instruments and other kinds of stuff. It's a pretty progressive album. It has some really strong stuff with it. I think some of the earlier stuff on the album is quite good, and then some of the later stuff, maybe not so good, a little bit too John Anders sounding, if that's even a word. I don't think it is, but yeah. So a decent album. I think it's better than, of course, their first album for sure. But and probably better than most of the stuff that I've been listening to regularly after the 80s era. So not a bad album, though. I think it's a good return to form, but not to the point where it's going to rival any of that classic stuff. And I think that's their 17th studio album. So their next album, all right, keeps trying to send me stuff here. Okay, the next album up is this one, which was the one I was playing just before I came on the air, Magnification. Very different. Definitely no Roger Dean on this. It's kind of reminiscent of Open Your Eyes in the cover part, although I think it's a little bit better and more sophisticated. This one's a little bit different. Yeah, strong. It's a bit of a heavier album than some of their predecessors too. It's fairly lengthy, and then this particular one has 3 bonus tracks as well, which I've listened to. So this was released September the 10th, 2001, the day my daughter was born. So that's probably the most notable thing for me about it, is it came out exactly the same day she was born, and the same year. So Santa Barbara Sound Design in Santa Barbara, California, which is where it was recorded. Where it was recorded. It's about 60 minutes in length, so same as its last album. Eagle label again, and Beyond Music in the US, so they've done this before as well. Tim Werdner and Yes doing the recording. So I've listened to this about 2 or 3 times now. I don't mind it. It really hasn't had anything that has stood out to me at this point in time, but I don't mind the album. It's pretty decent. I'm just going to pull up personnel on it. Yeah, so basically there are the 4 of them on here now. Just Anderson, Howe, Squire, and White are the only 4 on this. But they have some additional add-on musicians like Larry Krupe, the conductor, doing the orchestral parts. And of course, the San Diego Philharmonic Orchestra is on here. Igor Koroshev does some parts here, mostly the live stuff on the bonus tracks, I think. And then Tom Brislin on keyboards on some of the live tracks as well. So it's a different sound to it. It's a little bit of a heavier album, I think, myself. So Yes's Magnification, their 18th studio album. Moving right along. So the next album out is an album that I like a lot, but I know that some people have bashed it a bit. I get that. I understand why too. So this is an album, to my understanding, Has some tracks on its Fly From Here. So it is a nice little booklet on it. A couple of CDs here going on. I'll give you the basic information first. This was released on the 22nd of June, 2011. So quite a few years have passed at this point. More than 10. Sarm West Studios in London, England. Sarm West Coast Studios in Los Angeles, California. Langley Studios in Devon, England. And Schwartz Studios in Sussex, England. It's about 47 minutes long, so they've reined it in a bit here, which is good. I do like this album cover quite a bit. It's on the Frontiers record label and produced by Trevor Horn. So Trevor Horn's back here. So as far as personnel goes, this is the Soul album with Benoit David doing the lead vocals. I think he does a good job. Doesn't sound exactly like John Anderson, but he's definitely in that same range. Steve Howe is, of course, on here. Chris Squire, Alan White, and Jeff Downs doing the keyboards. And Trevor Horn doing some lead vocals on some parts of this song. I think it's bonus stuff, maybe. Anyways, then you've got all kinds of additional information stuff. Oliver Wakeman doing some stuff here on We Can Fly and We Can Fly reprise, and Hours of Need and In the Storm, and then Justin Jardim on percussion. So you've got a few additions. So Oliver Wakeman, obviously the son of Rick Wakeman here. It's a good colored album. I like the color coordination here. I think the logo could have been either yellow or green, though, but other than that, it's pretty solid. Songs on here I like quite a bit. Fly From Here, the overture, and Fly From Here Part 1. I like both those versions. Actually, almost all the Fly From Here stuff I like quite a bit. Yeah, it's a pretty solid album. The Fly From Here stuff is kind of reminiscent of some earlier Yes stuff from decades before. So, yeah, good album. I like it. Probably my favorite of the post-classic era albums. Now we're going to get to the more newer, the most recent stuff. Well, there's actually one more album before we get to that. So you've got Heaven and Earth, which I don't own, and I'm not going to say hardly anything about other than I'll give you the stats on it. So Heaven and Earth was two things about Heaven and Earth. It was released on July 16th, 2014. So a few years after the Fly From Here. This was the last album featuring Chris Squire, so he passed away after this album. Neptune Studios in Los Angeles. About 51 minutes on the Frontier label, and you have Roy Thomas Baker as the producer of the album. I don't actually own the album. Many people have told me it's the worst Yes album. I have no reason to doubt them based on who they were. Ooh, I screwed that up. Try that again. So this has Steve Howe, Chris Squire, Alan White, Jeff Downs, and John Davidson also doing vocals on here, but this is his first album. The album didn't do that very well. A lot of people say it's not that great, and kind of the first of the well, even though Chris Squire was on, it's kind of the first of the John Davidson albums that people haven't really liked that much. So we're going to go to the final two albums now. So I bought both of these brand new. I do like both of them to a certain point. So this one, the thing about this album, I'm going to give you the vitals on it first. So this is The Quest. Really good cover, I think. Nice pictures and stuff on the inside of the album came with it. But it's the first of the kind of double album stuff. I don't know why they did this. Could have easily put all of the tracks on one album, but for some reason, and I've seen a few bands do this, they put 3 tracks on another album, and then 8 tracks on the first album. Could have easily put them both on all together, but they didn't. So this was released October 1st, 2021, so a few years ago. It's also the last album with Alan White. He passed away after this as well. Uncle Rehearsal Studio in Van Nuys, California, and Curtis Schwartz Studio in Ardleigh, West Sussex, which is, of course, in England. Fame's Projective Studio and Orchestra, that's where the orchestra was. Skopje, New North Macedonia. It's a progressive rock album. There's no doubt about that. 61 minutes in length, In and Out Music, Sony Music, and Steve Howe is the producer. And this is Steve Howe's first production. Not that great. I mean, other than the Ice Bridge, which is the opening track, which is fantastic. If they did more songs like that, this would have been a great album. That's a fantastic song. Maybe the best song they produced in a very long time. The rest of the songs, not terribly memorable, very kind of almost elevator-ish. That's the way I describe it. It's an elevator sounding. If not for the opening track, this would be a terrible, maybe the worst album they produced. But that opening track really elevates it quite a bit. It's easily the best song. And then the next song's not bad. The song after that and the two songs after that, okay. And then the rest is totally unmemorable. Same with the second album. So not going to say too much more about that. And then we're going to get to the last Yes album, or the most recent one, Mirror to the Sky. A little bit of a jump up for them. So this is the first album that John Davidson is on that I actually think is good. So this album is called Mirror to the Sky. Great cover. Roger Dean cover for sure. Again, this one is produced by Steve Howe, so this is a second attempt. Much better attempt, I might add. Again, though, they have that two CD with 3 songs on the bonus disc, which makes no difference. It makes no sense. Why not just throw them all onto one? But they didn't. It's a good put together cover, though. It's a good booklet. Comes with a booklet. It's a good solid album, I think. So released May the 19th, 2023. So just over a year ago. Well, maybe a year and a half now. Curtis Swartz Studio, Addingley, West Sussex. Fame's Project Studio for the orchestra again in Skopje, North Macedonia. It's about 63 minutes long, so slightly longer than The Quest. Produced by Steve Howe and on the same record label, Inside Out Music and Sony Music. Yeah, so a decent album. I'm just going to give you because this is the first post Alan White era. So Alan White passed away between this album and the previous one. John Davidson on vocals here. Steve Howe, all the different guitars and instruments. Jeff Downs, organ and keyboards and all the keyboard stuff. Billy Sherwood on bass guitar, taking over for, of course, on the last album, he took over for Chris Squire. And then you've got Jay Schellern, who does the drums and percussion, who was on The Quest, but did parts and bits and pieces, but now is taking over the drums completely now. I think that is a big plus for this band. Alan White wasn't doing as well. He was struggling a lot. And I think this guy just picked up slack. He's a good drummer. I like most of the tracks on this album. They're pretty strong, especially on the first disc, I think are better. Mirror to the Sky is really good. Cut from the Stars. Yeah, some good solid stuff. This is a little bit heavier. Well, it's a lot heavier an album than The Quest, and I think that's the reason why I like it a lot more. It's a little bit more like that Ice Bridge song, which was great on The Quest. They tried to do more of that here. They didn't do as well as that, but the overall stuff is better. I think this may be the best Yes album since Chris Squire passed away. And, really, you're probably going back to the latter Gates of Ascension era where those albums weren't too bad. I think this is better than them, but, you might have to actually go back to the classic era to find an album as good as this one. So it's a strong album. I like it. I hope they do more of this and less of The Quest. That would be my guess, and that's what I would like. So, Yes, as you know, has gone through a multitude of musicians throughout their era. I mean, most people kind of think of the classic Yes as Steve Howe, Chris Squire, Rick Wakeman, John Anderson, and either Bill Bruford or Alan White, either one. There's proponents who like either one of them, but there's a lot of proponents that don't like one or the other. I can't imagine not liking Bill Bruford, though, but there are people who, for whatever reason, didn't really like Alan White. I liked him. I didn't have a problem with him. I prefer Bill Bruford, but I didn't dislike him. And then you had a sprinkling of other musicians who came in and out of the band, had impact. Trevor Horn, Jeff Downs, Trevor Rabin. I'm trying to think of the keyboardist. I can't think of his name. Of course, Tony Kaye, some and quite a few. They've had quite a few instrument people in the band. Now, currently, only Steve Howe is from that classic era of the band that's still with them, and he's not even an original. So there are no original members in Yes anymore. Only, I guess, the closest to that would be Steve Howe who was on the Yes album. That was his first one. So he wasn't in the first two studio albums, but everybody from those two albums are gone from the band, although John Anderson is still around and Bill Bruford is still around and Tony Kaye is still around, but none of them are currently in the band. So anyways, Yes, one of the great rock bands in the prog universe. And I like them quite a bit. I do love everything that they've done. Well, varying degrees, but they're one of my favorite rock bands. Until recently, they were either first or second. Rush took back over the first place position back in the early part of this century. And then, but Yes has been in that second spot for a long time, till very recently when I decided that Jethro Tull was going to move into that second spot. But still, in one of my group of 9 now, and I still love them. I still think they're one of the great bands, and some of my favorite musicians are in the band. So anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this kind of streaming discussion about the band. Yes, I hope that if you have any comments, you can put them in the comment section. I'll try to answer them if I can. I hope to see you all. I'm going to try to do this regularly, so I will start posting something regularly to get more of a group of people coming in. Anyways, I hope to see you then. So have yourself a good night and a good day. Take care and goodbye.